There is a much broader discussion required, one that transcends our current scope, and I believe that is the focus we must prioritize. Hopefully, we can create the space for a meaningful dialogue, because right now we are dealing with a situation that demands a deeper look. It is not merely about a single toxic comment or an isolated social media post. The All-Star event has become a flashpoint for players, insisting that things must evolve. Yet the real mystery is what exactly they expect Caitlin Clark to resolve. Aja Wilson is sending a direct signal to Clark, suggesting that when they meet at All-Star Weekend, they are going to have a serious face-to-face discussion. The video kicks off by reframing this situation as a direct confrontation between prominent WNBA figures like Aja Wilson, Chelsea Gray, and Caitlin Clark, portraying the upcoming All-Star festivities as a battleground for accountability rather than a showcase of athletic talent. This narrative hook is effective because it strikes at the core tension that has defined the league over the past 2 years. Clark is the engine for the league's growth, drawing in record viewership and sparking mainstream attention that the organization chased for decades. However, this influx of visibility arrived with baggage, dragging in a volatile mix of superfans, vocal critics, political agitators, sports bettors, trolls, and various opportunists who treat women's hoops as a proxy war for larger societal friction. The issue isn't whether harassment exists, it clearly does, but rather how the league manages it without forcing every fan of Clark into a defensive position. The real concern surfaces later, when even the individual who shared the original post acknowledges this wasn't an isolated incident. That revelation shifts the narrative, creating an expectation that she must step forward and forcefully denounce her own fan base. The demand is for her to publicly issue an ultimatum, essentially telling her supporters that if they continue to follow her, they must boycott the league. It's in this moment that the commentary reaches its most aggressive point, suggesting that players will soon require Caitlin Clark to disavow her supporters entirely and explicitly demand they stop viewing games if they choose to act out. To be clear, this is not a verified policy or a formal declaration from the league officials. We have no direct footage of Aja Wilson making such a demand, nor any official memo or press release from the WNBA supporting this. Instead, we are seeing a commentator synthesize the current climate and amplify it toward the most extreme, dramatic interpretation. Still, this framing resonates with some because Clark has been thrust into an impossible predicament. When she receives accolades, she is accused of overshadowing her peers. If others lash out in her name, she is blamed for not intervening. If she offers a neutral response, her restraint is painted as complicity. Yet if she speaks out, her words are dissected for not being enough. That is the paradox of her situation, and it reveals that Caitlin Clark is trapped in a no-win scenario. She is caught in a cycle where, no matter her action, she cannot satisfy the expectations placed upon her. Beyond just hitting the court, she's expected to navigate the reactions of total strangers while avoiding the appearance of feeling entitled to the league's success. That is exactly why this controversy keeps spiraling. It is no longer restricted to a single athlete. It's about assigning blame for the nature of the WNBA's expanding fan base. What is happening in the league regarding toxic fan behavior and hurtful commentary is something prevalent across every professional sport. Some suggest these athletes are simply too thin-skinned to handle the pressure. The commentator provides a sharp rebuttal. Every major organization deals with hostile supporters. Stars in the NBA, NFL, MLB, and beyond are routinely mocked, harassed, or memed, and it never ceases. The argument suggests the WNBA craved the massive exposure of big-time sports without wanting to deal with the darker side of that fame. Yet, that logic has its limits. There is a distinct divide between fans criticizing a subpar performance and individuals sending racist or bigoted harassment directly to a player's private messages. Analyzing a game is fair. Targeted abuse is not. If someone says Chelsea Gray played poorly, that is a far cry from someone sending vitriol to her mobile device. The problem is how digital discourse conflates everything into one category. Jests become harassment, critique turns into bullying, and discourse shifts into racism. Everything then gets tied to Clark supporters. People argue from their most extreme viewpoints, and in that vacuum, basketball is forgotten. The conversation shifts to who has the moral authority to be a fan, who is guilty, and who must answer for the actions of strangers. I took a photo of it so it could not be scrubbed away. Initially, I mentioned it to my spouse. Following that, I started a group thread with Asia, Jackie, and Jewel. The first reaction was just, post it. And I told them, I just wanted to keep you all in the loop. Chelsea Gray confirmed she grabbed a screenshot to preserve the evidence, shared it with her wife, and then looped in Aja Wilson, Jackie Young, and Jewel Lloyd. Asia's advice, as Gray remembers, was blunt. Publish it. This is significant because it proves this wasn't just a spontaneous, reactionary outburst. Gray states she gave it thought, consulted her circle, and informed her agent and teammates before going public. From her perspective, the logic holds. If you endure abuse in silence, the audience never witnesses the toll. They only see the highlights, the stats, and the final. They miss what happens when the stadium clears out and the phone notifications won't stop. But for the critics, the timing is also a factor. The discussion immediately pivots toward the Fever matchup, debating the timing of the upload fundamentally altered how the message was perceived. When that image hit the web immediately following a major game featuring Clark's squad, onlookers didn't just see vitriol. They saw a narrative being pinned onto a specific group of supporters. This creates a sharp divide. Some argue Gray successfully illuminated a genuine issue, while others contend she chose a moment that unfairly implicated Clark's followers through association. Both perspectives can coexist. The malicious nature of the message is undeniable, yet the strategic release remains open to critique. She deliberately hit publish after the Indiana Fever match precisely because she understood the implications. Digging into her history, people have unearthed long-standing Instagram insults. This marks a significant shift in the focus of the video. The pundit asserts that the timing was a calculated choice, noting that trolls had been leaving abusive comments on her account for ages. In essence, the dispute isn't whether the harassment occurred, but rather that the behavior wasn't a new phenomenon, which turns the timeline into the central issue. The complexity lies there. If Gray had encountered this sort of hostility previously, uploading a screenshot following the Fever loss doesn't serve as definitive proof that the culprit was a Fever fan, nor does it prove she aimed to scapegoat them. It simply demonstrates that the public viewed it through a narrow lens, and online, context is frequently stripped away. A captured image rarely carries nuance. Instead, it is loaded with subtext, tied to the latest game, and tethered to whoever happens to be trending. It travels alongside the volatile mood of the fanbase, which in the Clark era is perpetually at a boiling point. Every Fever outing turns into a cultural referendum. Victories are hailed as her saving the sport, while defeats lead to claims of manufactured hype. If another athlete voices concerns, Clark is pulled into the fray. If the media references Fever supporters, the digital mob begins a forensic deep dive into the source. That is the reason. This didn't stay a simple report of harassment. It morphed into a battle over accountability. Who is responsible for the toxic behavior? Who gets to define it? And who gains an advantage when the finger is pointed at the Clark camp? I believe the starting point is actually revealing what is being said, moving it out from behind a device, screen or mobile phone. By making it tangible, you ensure people can see and acknowledge it. Gray argues that the goal of sharing is to confront the public with the reality of digital abuse. That represents the strongest aspect of her stance. Public exposure acts as a catalyst for responsibility. And honestly, there is a clear motivation for athletes taking this route. Organizations are often sluggish to act, and faceless profiles vanish. Fans might act like nothing occurred. Yet when an athlete shares that evidence, the public finally witnesses the toxicity usually kept under wraps. The real peril follows immediately after. Once that post goes viral, the narrative no longer belongs solely to the athlete. It is seized by any profile looking to exploit it. Some leverage it to denounce bigotry. Others weaponize it against supporters of Clark. Some use it to target Gray. Others claim the WNBA is overly fragile. Some recycle tired grievances regarding identity, orientation, gender, news coverage, and the intended demographic of the sport. This is why the organization faces a tougher task than simply urging everyone to be kind. It must differentiate genuine harassment from legitimate critique of the game. It must defend its players without maligning entire communities of supporters. It has to recognize that the fan base following Clark consists of millions of everyday people, not just the most aggressive voices online. And it must balance all of those pressures, while the league's commercial arm desperately relies on these eyeballs to remain invested. Because this is the harsh reality. The WNBA cannot chase massive mainstream appeal and then treat that very influx of interest like a hostile takeover. Simultaneously, it cannot allow athletes to be victimized and excuse it as the price of doing business. Honestly, we got completely destroyed. I don't know. I've just reached my limit. I can't even come up with any other explanation. Honestly, it's not really like. I mean, this isn't the first time I've received messages like this. It really isn't. There's been other stuff happening as well. I just made the call to expose that specific one. This is exactly where the question of timing becomes critical. Gray is probed about what changed during this particular instance, and she notes that she'd hit a breaking point. She mentions that these types of DMs aren't new and that there was plenty of other content too. That addresses both sides of the argument. It validates Gray by illustrating this wasn't some solitary hateful message that occurred in a vacuum. It also aids the skeptics by confirming she possessed other instances and simply elected to publicize this one right after that specific match. But the larger problem remains that the WNBA hasn't established a coherent public strategy to handle this issue. Whenever vitriolic content emerges, the league and the press often default to generic ethical platitudes. They condemn intolerance, which is clearly needed, yet the broader debate almost instantly devolves into pinning it on this group or that fan base, Clark supporters versus the old guard, and suddenly everyone is splitting millions of individuals into rival factions. That isn't accountability, that's just inflammatory rhetoric. If the perpetrator is a sports bettor, identify them as such. If they're merely a troll with zero actual ties to the athlete, state that clearly. If they are a fever loyalist, provide proof before pinning that label on them. If they identify as a Clark fan, produce the evidence. If the proof is absent, do not let the blame exceed what the facts can actually support. That methodology protects everyone. It protects Gray from bad faith actors downplaying what she was sent. This shields Clark from having to account for the actions of random trolls. It also safeguards fever supporters from being unfairly generalized. Additionally, it keeps the league from appearing like it only cares about abuse when it is politically convenient to do so. Goodness. But I am sure people will hesitate now. We are just playing the game. What exactly are people going to hesitate about? Am I meant to suggest you cannot shoot layups or that you cannot grab rebounds? The commentary scoffs at the idea that sharing a post will make people pause. It contends that anyone malicious enough to send hate initially likely won't change just because a player shared one screenshot. That perspective holds some practical merit. Publicly shaming one user might punish them, but it doesn't solve the systemic issue. The internet can churn out new profiles within minutes. Betting-related rage won't vanish simply because one individual is unmasked. Rival fan groups won't suddenly turn polite because a player decides to take a stand. But that does not imply that speaking out is futile. It highlights to sponsors, corporations, leagues, and broadcast partners what players are enduring. It can bring repercussions to those who felt shielded by their anonymity. It can compel the league office to stop viewing player safety as a mere individual issue. The real question is whether the reaction is strategic or merely performative. A strategic response involves identifying accounts precisely, flagging threats, collaborating with digital platforms and law enforcement when required, and ensuring the penalty fits the offense. A performative reaction turns a screenshot into a blunt instrument to attack an entire group because that faction is already disliked by specific media figures. This is the thin line the narrative keeps treading. Gray deserves security from racial harassment. Clark deserves not to be blamed without proof. Fans deserve not to be labeled guilty simply because someone else used a username to spout slurs. And the WNBA deserves scrutiny if it cannot balance these three realities. Simultaneously, we strived so hard to accomplish. However, there is a certain schism that must be brought to everyone's awareness and the realization that no, this is a recurring problem, and it is reaching a boiling point where it is like, all right, enough is enough. Gray notes that there is a divide that needs to be highlighted and that the limit has been reached. That term division matters because it concedes this goes beyond just one private message. The WNBA is in a peculiar transition. It has more visibility than ever, yet it has not reached a consensus on what that visibility represents. For loyal supporters, the league predates Clark and will continue after her. Many recent followers tuned in specifically for Clark, yet veterans often perceive this sudden fixation on one newcomer as an injustice. To her dedicated fanbase, the hostility directed toward her appears both relentless and blatantly obvious. Every fresh dispute reinforces these perceptions. When athletes call out toxic fans, Clark's supporters interpret it as a direct attack. Conversely, when she receives accolades, loyalists of the league feel their own historical contributions are being scrubbed away. If executives highlight viewership spikes without acknowledging the veteran core, longtime observers demand to know why the pioneers are being sidelined. Should the WNBA avoid naming Clark as their primary catalyst, her followers argue the league is terrified of its own financial reality. Consequently, when Gray mentions friction, she might be referencing vitriol, but the public perceives a far more existential struggle. They see a battle for the league's identity. Is it the heritage WNBA amplified, or a new brand shaped entirely by Clark's influence. This represents the underlying tension within the All-Star discourse. It transcends a simple plea for fans to behave with basic decency. It is really an intense power struggle between the media, athletes, and the league over who truly defines the narrative. Hopefully, during the All-Star break, we can find time to have a constructive dialogue, because right now, there is something that serves as the prelude for the weekend, as players seek an open forum, yet the analyst immediately frames it as pressure directed at Caitlyn. Because something needs to shift, the commentator pivots to the narrative that this is an ultimatum aimed squarely at Clark. Furthermore, nothing in the recorded dialogue confirms Aja Wilson or Chelsea Gray intended to physically confront Clark at her hotel. That scenario is purely a dramatic, hyperbolic invention by the commentator, yet it resonates because it feeds an existing public anxiety. The fear is quite straightforward, that Clark will be coerced into a public apology for the behavior of strangers. Meanwhile, those who resent her status will conveniently repackage that forced contrition as an exercise in veteran leadership. This is why the situation is so volatile. It isn't strictly about Gray, Wilson, or even Clark herself. It centers on whether the organization will continue to task its most popular star with carrying the burden for every negative side effect. A truly equitable discussion would be league-wide rather than singular, addressing the influx of new attention with broader context. It should affirm that no athlete deserves to face racist, homophobic, or threatening behavior under any circumstances. It would clarify that debating on-court performance is valid, while demanding that media outlets stop projecting blame without concrete proof. It would assert that toxic supporters are unwelcome in the sport, regardless of which jersey they happen to be wearing. It would insist that players must not utilize the worst online actors as a means to deflect from entirely legitimate, constructive critiques. If the agenda merely becomes Caitlyn, fix your fans, the entire dialogue is doomed, as no individual athlete can police the internet. Online. LeBron never managed every Lakers supporter, nor did Brady dictate how Patriots fans behaved. Serena Williams never had total authority over every follower. I am pleased Chelsea had the chance to voice her concerns and highlight our ongoing struggles, which will likely persist until we engage in an honest dialogue. As Aja Wilson suggests here, Chelsea used her platform to express what athletes endure, noting that these issues will remain unaddressed without a real conversation. That is arguably the most logical interpretation of the player's perspective. They aren't avoiding critique, they're pointing out that toxic harassment has become an occupational hazard. They argue the public underestimates the sheer volume of hate, while the league happily capitalizes on higher ratings, ticket revenue, broadcast rights, and viral trends without helping athletes cope with the brutal side of that fame. This grievance shouldn't be ignored simply because a media member dislikes how it was presented. Elite stars are public figures, but they are human first. Having your private messages flooded with bile isn't professional feedback. Racist slurs aren't tactical analysis, and death threats aren't just fandom. Just because other leagues struggle with abuse doesn't validate it in the WNBA. Yet the players have a credibility gap to bridge. Many of Clark's followers feel the media and league are hyper-specific when calling them out, but strangely vague when defending them. They perceive every incident as a lecture about the influx of new viewers, even when the evidence is ambiguous. They see Clark enduring flagrant fouls, online ridicule, and blatant exploitation for viewership, only to be expected to apologize for the very base the league is profiting from. That cynicism won't evaporate, simply because a player demands change. It ends when the league enforces consistent standards across the board, punish toxicity without vilifying decent supporters, guard the athletes without labeling all criticism a sin, appreciate the league's growth without begrudging the star most tied to it. When lines are crossed, call out the specific individuals involved, rather than letting vague accusations cause widespread damage. That is the core message, revealed in the final act. The real tension isn't Chelsea Gray against Caitlyn Clark, nor Aja Wilson against Clark's fans. It is genuine accountability versus performative drama. One resolves conflict, the other creates monsters. Right. As if your experience is mundane, unimportant, or hardly worth mentioning, as if these issues don't warrant discussion. Some would dismiss it all as WNBA stars just whining because random people they don't even know are posting cruel comments and malicious vitriol. The pundit dismisses the entire argument, claiming the WNBA's current struggles are neither unique nor exceptional enough to warrant a league-wide discussion. This hardline stance will undoubtedly appeal to those who feel the organization is being overly sensitive, yet it ignores the commercial reality. Right now, the WNBA isn't just another typical professional league. It is currently experiencing a sudden, massive surge in visibility that has outpaced its own internal cultural adaptation. The surrounding media environment has eclipsed the sport itself, leaving athletes accustomed to a niche, supportive fan base, suddenly subject to the same relentless, digital-age scrutiny that defines the NBA and NFL landscape. However, lacking the decades of operational experience to manage such a massive spotlight doesn't grant players an exemption from critique. Rather, it demands that the organization institutionalize its approach to public attention. Revenue growth brings greater wealth, but it also necessitates stricter moderation, heightened security, more disciplined media relations, and a clearer sense of accountability among those driving the discourse. The worst possible strategy is to covet Clark's massive audience numbers while treating those very viewers like a toxic nuisance. That is the quickest way to alienate your new fan base. Conversely, it is equally damaging to suggest that just because the league is expanding, players are obligated to endure every form of harassment as a mandatory cost of their success. That mindset inevitably breeds deep-seated resentment. The league must navigate a middle path, set clear boundaries against threats and abuse, welcome rigorous basketball analysis, stop subtly pinning the blame on Clark, cease labeling every player complaint as a sign of weakness, and stop using the internet's most toxic fringes as a barometer for what millions of genuine fans actually believe. This is the only way out of this cycle. Otherwise, the same pattern repeats. A player receives a hostile message. A screenshot ignites social media. Fans are scapegoated. Clark gets pulled into the fray. Pundits take sides. Officials issue vague statements that convince no one. And then, the next tip-off is played under the same cloud of hostility. I've said it before and I'll say it again, everyone. We all need to take a step back. We need to pause. Look at the big picture and set aside the focus on Caitlin Clark. Toward the end of the day, the host suggests removing Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham from the narrative to view the league simply as a reality show. While intended as a dig, that observation inadvertently captures the current reality, as the WNBA is currently being consumed as a hybrid of high-level competition and scripted drama. The outcomes of the games matter, but so do the reactions they trigger. Statistical box scores are significant, but so are the post-game soundbites. Rivalries drive interest, as do the circulating controversies. Supporters are not just tracking winners. They are tracking who takes the heat and who is targeted, shielded, who receives a promotion, who faces mockery, who is depicted as envious or spiteful, and who the association decides to shield. This strategy aids engagement but erodes credibility. If the WNBA aspires to attain legitimate status as a premier professional organization, it must stop centering every dispute on one athlete's supporters. It requires nuance. Where did the communication originate? What was the intent? Harassment, intimidation, or mere disagreement? Is there proof linking these remarks to specific franchises? What was the outcome? These inquiries are fundamental, yet they vanish when drama overtakes the truth. Regarding Caitlin Clark, the balance is delicate. She certainly can and should denounce harassment when addressed sincerely, though she shouldn't feel obligated to vilify a massive demographic encompassing families, children, loyal college supporters, fresh, league observers, everyday spectators, and fans who just appreciate her court vision. The WNBA requires these individuals. Every player gains from their attention, and broadcast networks are investing specifically for them. You cannot expand an enterprise by treating the audience like they are on trial. The core dilemma is clear. Will the league ensure athletes' safety by holding real offenders accountable? Or will it continue allowing isolated social media posts to indict Clark's entire following? Post your thoughts below. Hit like for the complete analysis.